In the shadows of El Salvador's massive crackdown on crime lies an unsettling reality: prisons overflowing with hopelessness, silence, and alleged abuse. What's the cost of fighting crime when it means erasing human rights? El Salvador has declared war on its famous gangs, arresting tens of thousands under a state of emergency. While many citizens celebrate this as a victory, the stories emerging from behind bars paint a darker picture. The centerpiece of this operation is the Terrorism Confinement Center, cecot, a mega-prison that has done wonders but is popular for its awful conditions. Yet, with President Nayib Bukele's approval ratings rising, the nation stands at a crossroads. This is a tale of power, fear, and what happens when justice is stripped of humanity. State of emergency and mass incarceration. Since March 2022, El Salvador has been operating under a state of emergency in an unusual attempt to combat gang violence. The government, under President Nayib Bukele, has arrested over 81,000 individuals in less than 2 years. A shocking figure that reflects the administration's zero-tolerance approach to crime. However, this crackdown comes at a high cost. Most arrests have been carried out without due process, raising alarm bells among human rights organizations. Stories have surfaced of innocent people being detained alongside gang members, sometimes based on little more than tattoos or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The government has suspended constitutional rights, including the presumption of innocence and access to legal defense, creating a vacuum of justice. Families often find themselves in the dark, unable to locate loved ones or secure their release. While the streets have seen a drop in violence and gang activity, the widespread arrests have also caused concern among citizens, who now live with the risk of being unfairly detained. For many Salvadorans, this iron fist policy feels like a difficult compromise, sacrificing personal freedoms and civil rights in exchange for public safety. Critics argue that this sweeping approach does little to address the root causes of crime, potentially leaving society in a more fractured and unstable situation in the long term. Conditions in the Terrorism Confinement Center, cecot, to house the flood of detainees resulting from its mass arrests, the Bukele administration constructed the Terrorism Confinement Center, or cecot. The facility's capacity to hold up to 40,000 inmates makes it one of the largest prisons in the world. Yet behind its high-security walls lies a dark reality that has drawn worldwide outrage. Cells meant for a few dozen inmates are overcrowded with hundreds, forcing prisoners to sleep on floors or remain standing for hours. Natural light is limited, and the prison provides minimal access to fresh air, reinforcing the feeling of complete isolation. Basic necessities like clean water, food, and medical care are limited, with reports of detainees suffering from malnutrition and untreated illnesses. For many, the conditions are a form of psychological and physical torture, designed not just to punish, but to break the human spirit. Global monitoring organizations have described cecot as a modern dungeon where human rights are systematically ignored. The government, however, defends its actions, arguing that the facility is an essential tool in their war against gangs. While some Salvadorans see the mega-prison as a symbol of strength and justice, others fear it represents the normalization of inhumane treatment, signaling a transition into a system that values punishment over rehabilitation and human dignity. Human rights violations against minors. One of the most frightening aspects of El Salvador's crackdown on gang violence is the treatment of minors. Over 3,000 children, some as young as 12, have been detained under the state of emergency, with many reportedly having no concrete ties to gangs. The stories are heartbreaking. Teenagers pulled from their homes without explanation, young boys locked away indefinitely for simply living in neighborhoods under gang control. Once inside the prison system, these minors face harsh conditions similar to those of adults. Overcrowded cells, a lack of basic needs, and, in many cases, abuse and mistreatment. For children, the psychological impact is particularly tragic because they are often thrown into a harsh, violent environment where survival becomes the only goal. International human rights groups have repeatedly called on El Salvador to end the unlawful detention of minors and respect their rights. Yet Bukele's administration continues to dismiss these criticisms, portraying the arrests as necessary in the fight against gang recruitment. While many Salvadorans remain supportive of the government's tough-on-crime approach, the long-term impact on these children and their families could have dangerous consequences. The cycle of poverty and violence that already traps much of the nation's youth may only worsen, as thousands of minors are forced to carry the scars of imprisonment into adulthood. International criticism and sanctions. The aggressive measures taken by El Salvador have not gone unnoticed by the international community. Human rights organizations, foreign governments, and global bodies like the United Nations have issued harsh criticism of President Bukele's policies. They argue that the extended period of emergency and mass arrests violate international human rights laws and undermine democratic principles. Critics point to the suspension of constitutional rights, such as the right to a fair trial, as a potentially hazardous pattern that could destabilize the rule of law. Some countries have even proposed sanctions, calling for stricter scrutiny of El Salvador's actions. Yet Bukele's administration has maintained its rebellion, dismissing external criticism as an interference in domestic affairs. On the home front, many Salvadorans stand firmly behind their president, viewing the international outcry as misplaced and overly sympathetic to criminals. They argue that the nation's previous attempts to curb gang violence through softer means had failed spectacularly, leaving Bukele's harsh policies as the only viable solution. However, the global spotlight on El Salvador raises serious questions about its long-term stability. Can a country truly achieve peace if it disregards the rights and freedoms of its citizens? The world waits to see whether Bukele's tactics will be copied or serve as a warning tale of excessive authority. Media access and transparency. El Salvador's government has tightly controlled the press coverage surrounding its crackdown on gangs, leaving little room for scrutiny or opposition. Media access to prisons like cecot is heavily restricted, with reporters rarely allowed to document the conditions inside. When journalists do manage to uncover abuses, they risk facing legal consequences under gag laws designed to curb criticism. These laws prohibit reporting that could be perceived as supporting gangs, effectively suppressing opposing voices. The lack of transparency has made it nearly impossible for independent organizations to hold the government accountable. Furthermore, propaganda has played a key role in shaping public opinion, with the administration releasing carefully chosen images of gang members in chains or crowded cells to portray their policies as a success. However, this media control has also fueled international skepticism. Critics argue that the government's obsession with appearance undermines the democratic values it claims to uphold. While Bukele's supporters praise the administration for cleaning up the streets, others worry that the suppression of free speech signals a shift toward authoritarianism. The silencing of media and dissenting voices not only delays accountability, but also creates a dangerous environment where abuses can flourish unchecked. As the situation unfolds, the battle over information becomes as critical as the war against gangs. Long-term societal impact. While the immediate effects of El Salvador's hardline policies are visible: cleaner streets, reduced homicide rates, and the restoration of public spaces, the long-term societal impact remains uncertain. The aggressive imprisonment of tens of thousands has disrupted families and communities, leaving countless children without parents and neighborhoods without their breadwinners. Experts warn that such widespread detention might worsen poverty and inequality, fueling the very conditions that breed crime. Moreover, the negative perception of imprisonment will likely haunt former inmates for years, making reintegration into society difficult, if not impossible. Many will struggle to find jobs or rebuild their lives, further deepening patterns of poverty and hopelessness. On a broader level, the erosion of democratic institutions and the normalization of authoritarian practices could have lasting consequences for Salvadoran society. The suspension of constitutional rights, along with the suppression of free speech, sets a hazardous pattern that may outlive the current administration. While Bukele's crackdown has undeniably delivered a sense of security to many, the question remains: at what cost? A society that prioritizes security over freedom risks losing both, as the roots of crime remain unaddressed and the social fabric continues to fall apart. El Salvador's deadly prison system is a haunting reflection of the balance between security and human rights. While the crackdown has brought a sense of relief to a nation once terrorized by gangs, it has also exposed a troubling willingness to sacrifice democracy, freedom, and dignity. The stories from behind prison walls are not just about crime and punishment, they are about the soul of a nation battling with its future. President Bukele's bold policies have undeniably changed the landscape of El Salvador, but at what cost? As the world watches, one question remains unanswered. Can peace built on fear and oppression ever truly last? The road ahead is uncertain, marked by the scars of those who paid the price for safety.